Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a chilling collection of true, scary cemetery stories for you to enjoy. If you're new here and would like to be notified of every upload, please press subscribe and the bell icon for good measure. You know the drill. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I lived for most of my childhood in a large, aging house that we would later discover had once operated as a funeral home many decades before we ever moved in. At the time we bought it, no one mentioned anything unusual about the property, and we of course had no knowledge of this. Although the atmosphere inside always carried a certain sense of foreboding and unwelcomeness, it was especially apparent to visitors who noticed almost immediately without being able to explain why they felt uncomfortable there. The basement was the first place that made me suspicious, long before I ever researched the history of the place, because its layout made very little sense for a normal family home, and it looked intentionally designed for purposes that were not domestic. The floor had old drains set into the concrete that newer renovations failed to hide completely, and the walls were tiled in sections that felt sterile rather than practical, creating an environment that always felt colder than the rest of the house regardless of season or heating. Years later, curiosity finally pushed me into looking up property records and historical archives, which confirmed that the building had indeed served as a funeral home and that the basement had been used for preparing bodies before burial services were held upstairs. Behind the house sat a small yard that appeared ordinary at first glance, although scattered throughout the grass were several small gravestones belonging to children who died during the 19th century from illness that spread rapidly throughout the area at the time. Many of the names have worn away almost entirely, leaving shallow carvings and dates that reveal heartbreakingly short lifespans. Standing among those graves always makes me feel uneasy. The first experience I could never explain away happened late one winter night while I was alone in the house playing Crash Bandicoot. I was in my bedroom long after everyone else had left for the evening. Snow covered the ground outside, muffling the outdoor sounds, and the glow of the television provided the only light in my room as I focused entirely on my game. Without warning, I heard a child laughing loudly, disrupting the silence in the hallway outside my bedroom door, and the sound carried genuine excitement that made my stomach tighten because no one else should have been inside the house at that time. The laughter continued for several seconds before turning into the unmistakable sound of small footsteps running quickly down the hallway, moving away from my room with playful energy that felt very out of place for the situation. And I sat there frozen, for longer than I would like to admit, before finally gathering enough courage to open my door and check the hallway, expecting at any moment to see someone hiding or running away. The hallway was completely empty. Every light remained off, and the air felt noticeably colder, as though a window had been opened somewhere, even though I couldn't see any that had been done so. I searched every room carefully before going downstairs to check the doors and windows, all of which were still locked exactly as they had been earlier that evening. Outside, the snow remained perfectly undisturbed, no footprints anywhere near the house, leaving me without any explanation that could make any logical sense. About a week later, my sister was sitting downstairs watching television when she casually mentioned seeing a young boy standing halfway up the staircase watching her quietly from the shadows. She described him as wearing clothes that looked extremely old-fashioned, resembling something taken from photographs over a century ago. She assumed at first that it was me, trying unsuccessfully to scare her. According to her, the boy slowly turned around after several seconds and walked calmly back up the stairs before disappearing completely before reaching the top landing, leaving her confused rather than frightened, until she realized I had never been upstairs at all. After that conversation, both of us began noticing strange sounds throughout the house with increasing frequency, including coughing coming from the basement when no one was down there, and slow footsteps moving across floors during hours when everyone was accounted for elsewhere. The sounds never felt aggressive or violent, but they became hard to dismiss. One of the most disturbing experiences involved the doorbell, which began ringing randomly at different times of the day and night, despite no one being outside when my father checked. He initially thought it was faulty wiring, so he removed the batteries from the unit entirely in an attempt to stop the interruptions. The doorbell rang again several nights later, prompting him to disconnect the wiring completely and remove components from the wall so the system physically could not function anymore under any circumstances. Despite those efforts, the bell rang once again one evening while all of us were sitting together in the living room, producing a clear sound that echoed throughout the house. No one was willing to approach the front door after that. Roughly 12 years passed, and eventually my sister moved back into the same house after it had been empty for some time, believing that whatever we experienced belonged firmly in the past. Not long after settling in, she called me one night and told me she had started seeing the little boy again, although his appearances were happening far more often than before. She explained that he no longer stayed confined to the staircase, and instead appeared briefly in the hallway or doorways, sometimes watching silently before vanishing the moment she focused directly on him. Recently, she told me his expression has changed noticeably, shifting from neutral curiosity into something more unsettling that she describes as a mix of sadness and anger. When she asked whether I still remembered hearing laughter in the hallway all those years ago, I realized I had never truly stopped thinking about the moment or the feeling that someone had been running happily through the house. Based on what she's saying, I think whatever is haunting, presumably from the graveyard, isn't happy anymore. I wonder if leaving the house abandoned pissed it off. I have lived in Oklahoma for my whole life, and one of the biggest hobbies has always been searching for abandoned places that most people either overlook or completely forget exist. Exploring old buildings and hidden locations has never really frightened me before, because I usually enjoy learning about history while experiencing places that feel frozen in time. A few months ago, I learned about a forgotten graveyard located only 10 minutes away from my house, which shocked me because I had never once heard anyone mention it despite living in the area my whole life. The discovery immediately caught my attention, so I began researching the location online to make sure I understood exactly where I was planning to go and whether visiting it would be safe. I wanted to avoid trespassing or accidentally wandering into somewhere dangerous, so I spent several evenings reading whatever information I could find about the property and its history. Eventually, I learnt that the graveyard marked the site of an old schoolhouse that had disappeared long ago, and because there was no visible marker or maintained entrance, most people gradually forgot it existed unless they had family buried there. I decided that if I visited, I would go during daylight hours so I could clearly see my surroundings, especially since the area sat far away from town in open countryside with very little nearby activity. Before making the trip, I asked my sister if she wanted to come along, because exploring alone suddenly felt like a bad idea, and I am incredibly grateful now that she agreed without hesitation. We woke up early the next morning to avoid the worst summer heat, knowing that Oklahoma temperatures become unbearable quickly once the sun climbs high into the sky. The drive itself took only about 10 minutes, although finding the exact location proved far more difficult because the entrance blended almost perfectly into the surrounding land. After finally locating a narrow path leading inwards, we parked nearby and stepped out into tall grass that had grown unchecked for years, immediately realizing how easily someone could miss the graveyard entirely while passing by. The vegetation covered most of the headstones so completely that we had to walk slowly and carefully, constantly watching our footing to avoid accidentally stepping on graves hidden under the undergrowth. We spent nearly an hour wandering quietly through the area, brushing aside grass and trying to read worn inscriptions. Eventually, we came across an open clearing where the schoolhouse once stood, marked by the uneven ground and subtle remnants of something important having existed there. Without any warning, we suddenly heard what sounded unmistakably like someone running directly towards us through the grass, fast enough that both of us instinctively stopped moving at the exact same time. When we turned to look, there was absolutely no one, which we felt especially unsettled by considering we were surrounded by miles of empty land. Neither of us scare easily, so we tried rationalizing the noise as an animal moving through the brush, or perhaps wind pushing through tall grass in an unnatural way. After searching the area carefully and finding nothing at all, we laughed it off and continued exploring while quietly acknowledging that moment of strangeness. The summer heat quickly became overwhelming, and we decided it was time to head back towards the car before staying outside became uncomfortable or unsafe. As we walked away from the clearing, the same sound returned suddenly behind us, except this time it moved faster and felt closer, as though something unseen was charging directly towards us. Neither of us waited to investigate further and immediately began running towards the car without a word, driven entirely by instinct rather than conscious thought. We did not slow down until we reached the vehicle, climbed inside and locked the doors while trying to steady our breathing and understand what just happened. While sitting there, I searched again online for information about the graveyard and discovered accounts from others who claimed the location had significant paranormal activity associated with it. Some stories described seeing figures walking among the graves, while others mentioned hearing voices asking for help, before vanishing moments later without explanation. Several people even warned against visiting at night, because experiences reportedly became far more intense after dark, which made me extremely grateful that we had chosen to visit during daylight instead. Thinking back on the experience afterwards, I realized how differently the situation might have unfolded if I had gone alone and heard unseen footsteps rushing towards me without anyone else there to confirm the sound. I have never returned to that graveyard since that day, and even thinking about it, and even thinking about going back still creates a lingering unease in me. I have experienced several things throughout my life that I still can't fully explain, and some of them have followed me for years. The first experience involves something my family eventually referred to as the man in our house, although none of us ever agreed on exactly what he was or why he seemed connected to the property. I have lived in only one house for nearly my entire life, aside from the brief period after my birth, where my parents and I stayed somewhere else that I can't remember at all. From my earliest memories, long before I understood fear in any meaningful way, I would regularly see shadow figures move along the hallway outside my bedroom, appearing both during daylight hours and late at night when the house would have been completely still. The figure never walked normally, and instead seemed to move in an unnatural bouncing motion from one room to another, crossing doorways quickly enough that I often questioned whether I had seen anything at all. My mother later admitted that she saw the same figure many times through the years, although my father rarely experienced anything unusual and often dismissed our stories as misunderstandings or tricks created by lighting and imagination. I would frequently return home from school trips or family holidays to discover my toys arranged in strange and deliberate ways, sometimes lined carefully along the edge of a bookshelf or positioned with their faces turned downwards towards the floor. As a child, I found these discoveries deeply unsettling, yet I constantly searched for reasonable explanations because believing something supernatural felt far more frightening than assuming an ordinary cause. I convinced myself that cleaners must have moved things while tidying the house, or that I had absent-mindedly rearranged them without remembering, even though the placements always felt intentional and unfamiliar. When I was around 9 years old, my parents divorced, and my mother struggled greatly during that period as the emotional weight of separation settled heavily over our home. She spent many evenings crying quietly after believing I'd gone to bed, and years later, she confessed something that changed how I viewed those memories entirely. During her worst moments, she said she often felt calm without understanding why, describing the sensation of a man gently placing his hands on her shoulders as though offering comfort while she grieved alone. She never saw anyone standing behind her, yet the feeling was consistent enough that she eventually stopped feeling afraid and instead associated it with reassurance during an incredibly painful time. Smaller occurrences continued throughout the years, including heavy footsteps moving down the hallway while I lay awake trying to fall asleep, and doors slamming loudly despite every window and entrance remaining firmly closed. These events became strangely normal over the time, blending into daily life. Many years later, while talking with my father about childhood memories, we began reminiscing about those strange experiences and attempted to find logical explanations that would finally make sense of everything we had witnessed. During that conversation, he revealed something he had never told me before, explaining that a man had taken his own life in the hallway before my parents purchased the house after losing both his wife and children. Hearing that information reframed countless memories instantly, turning small unexplained moments into something far more than coincidence, although none of us could ever prove any connection beyond unsettling timing. Interestingly, after we adopted a dog named Fletcher in 2017, nearly all unusual activity seemed to stop entirely, and the hallway finally felt empty in a way it never had before. The shadowy figure never appeared again, objects stopped moving, and the sound of footsteps disappeared completely, leaving us to wonder whether our new companion somehow changed whatever presence had lingered there for so long. Another experience that affected me deeply happened during my first trip to South Australia when I travelled with my mother and stepfather for Christmas celebrations with his extended family. During the gathering, I met my stepfather's brother and sister-in-law, and he happened to run a ghost hunting business and enthusiastically invited me to join an investigation the following evening. I agreed mostly out of curiosity and expected nothing more than an entertaining story to tell afterwards, assuming the entire experience would feel exaggerated and theatrical rather than genuinely unsettling. We drove to a cemetery known as St. John's Kapunda, located downhill from an abandoned reformatory once used for young girls, but now closed and inaccessible to the public. According to local stories, a girl named Ruby Bland became pregnant after being assaulted by a priest at the reformatory in the early 20th century, and was killed during an attempted abortion, leading to many people believe her spirit still searched the cemetery for her lost child. When we arrived, the atmosphere felt disappointingly ordinary, and for nearly 2 hours I believed the investigation confirmed my suspicion that ghost hunting relied mostly on imagination and suggestion. One member of our group appeared to exaggerate reactions to minor sounds, which made the experience feel staged and slightly embarrassing, rather than mysterious or convincing. Eventually, however, my attention became completely fixed on a large tree standing alone in one corner of the cemetery, and I found myself unable to look away despite having no clear reason for my sudden focus. A sensation settled over me, raising the hairs along my neck, while goosebumps spread across my arms, creating an intense awareness that felt separate from ordinary nervousness or excitement. I mentioned this feeling to my stepfather's brother, who suggested I take a recorder and speak aloud near the tree to see if anything responded. Although the idea felt awkward and slightly ridiculous, I walked towards the tree and began asking questions directed towards Ruby. Receiving no response for several minutes, while the night remained quiet and uneventful. Just as I decided to stop and return to the group, the entire environment seemed to fall into an unnatural silence, followed immediately by the sound of a girl sobbing and breathing directly beside my right ear. The sound was so loud and so close that my heart began pounding violently, and I ran back towards the others, feeling shaken in a way that I had never experienced before. For the remainder of the night I barely spoke, and apparently looked extremely pale, struggling to calm myself even after convincing my mind that the fear might have distorted my perception. Later, when we reviewed the recording, it captured unmistakable breathing sounds that none of us could explain, and I still occasionally wonder whether hearing it again would feel validating or more terrifying. The final experience I often think about happened shortly before my grandfather passed away in January of 2014, and I still cannot decide whether it represents coincidence or something stranger. About a month before his death, I experienced sleep paralysis for the first and only time in my life, dreaming that I fell into an open grave before suddenly waking with the overwhelming sensation of being buried alive in my own bed. The experience frightened me deeply at the time, although I eventually dismissed it as stress or an unusually vivid nightmare that held no deeper meaning. During my grandfather's funeral, family members approached the grave one by one, to throw poppies inside as a tribute to his service as an ANZAC, and I followed along without thinking too much about the dream earlier. After placing my poppy in the grave, I turned to walk back towards my seat, before my uncle suddenly stopped me and insisted that I return and do it again for reasons he never fully explained. As I approached the grave the second time, I tripped unexpectedly and experienced an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, instantly recalling the exact feeling of falling into a grave from my dream earlier. Fortunately, my uncle grabbed me before I could actually fall, leaving me shaken as I realized how closely the moment mirrored something I had already experienced while asleep weeks earlier. I still do not know whether these events share any connection or whether my mind simply created something meaningful afterwards. But remembering them all together always leaves me with an uneasy feeling. If anyone has experienced anything similar or has any thoughts about what any of this might mean, I would genuinely be interested in hearing your stories as well. This happened when I was 10 years old. I remember it vividly. These few days have always stayed with me. The first thing that was really impactful to me that happened was I had just been given my house key. I only lived about a 2-minute walk from my house, but it wasn't the point. The fact that I could walk home by myself at the end of school was absolutely huge for me. My mum and dad both worked and I was an only child. My dad usually worked a fair bit later because he started his job later in the morning, and I'd only really see him about 7 o'clock in the evening at the earliest. And maybe breakfast time. Which is why when I stuck my key in the door and twisted it and was met with my dad's face, was I suddenly put on edge. This was definitely out of the ordinary. I looked at his face, his whole demeanor. He was hunched over. He looked diminished, less than his usual self. That's when I realized something was very wrong indeed. And he told me Grandma had passed away. That was a big blow. I was really close to my grandma, his mother, and it came so sudden. She wasn't old, at least not in my perception, and I was fully taken aback. I had just spoken to her a few days ago. How was she suddenly dead? This, by the way, was the first death in my family, and at my age, it really hit me hard. I remember crying, waited until Mum came home, and we all collectively mourned. I drifted through those following days in a haze, and every time fear started to creep in at night, it was those vague thoughts about ghosts and dark hallways. I soothed myself with solid logical facts I'd heard thousands of times. That no one had ever died in our house, so there was nothing to be afraid of, right? That belief lasted right up until years later, when I found out I'd been wrong, but anyway, that's not the point of this story. So our town cemetery sat on the edge of nowhere. I remember walking through the gate between my parents, my mum's hand clamped around mine. We followed the hearse up the path, to the rectangle of open earth where my grandmother's remains were going to spend the rest of their existence. A priest came out, spoke slow, boring words, and I stared at the hole where my grandmother, my living grandmother just a week ago, was now destined to spend her time. As I said, the service was really boring. It was your perfectly dreary day as well to add insult to injury. A uniform grey sky. At least it wasn't raining. That's when I noticed something a bit further on along the graveyard. Another funeral was happening not too far away, with a second cluster of mourners gathered around another open grave a little further along. They were all dressed in dark clothes as well. Our ceremony ended with a prayer. I tossed my ceremonial handful of dirt, and that's when the people began chatting and slowly drifting back towards the parking area. We were going to have a wake at my grandmother's house. But I wanted to look at my grandma's grave one last time. And even though my mum gave me a gentle tug with her hand, I said I'd be there in a minute, and she and my father began walking back to the car. I looked down at the box, at the earth, and didn't really know what to think. And just as I was about to turn around, did I look up and see the other funeral people. I don't know what it was. Curiosity, I suppose, but I was drawn to it. And I slowly started making my way towards the other funeral happening. Maybe part of me was concerned it was someone I knew as well. And as I took a few cautious steps, I looked up and saw a woman whose face knocked every thought clean out of my head. She looked exactly like my mother, not in a kind of resembles way. But there were precise details that were the same eyes, the same shape of her mouth, the same tilt of her head, but subtly different. She didn't have my mother's grey hairs, and there were a few other details that I could only see and pick up on in that moment but have since forgotten. She turned towards me at that same moment, and her gaze locked onto mine. And I watched her expression change from weary distraction to stunned recognition and then pure horror, her eyes widening as the color visibly drained from her face. We stared at each other across the crowd. I wasn't really sure how to explain it, and I was feeling this deep sensation of utter wrongness. And in that moment I turned and ran back to the safety of my parents' car. I'd said nothing about the woman to them. Why should I? She was, just someone who looked like my mum. There's nothing else really to say. We went to the wake, did the whole thing, and life moved on. Years passed. I grew up, left my small town, and built a life for myself. But then, my mother's death came out of the blue as well. Her life had terminated in a very quick way as well. Someone ran a stop sign, whether in ignorance or a conscious choice, I'll never know. The point is, her body was completely destroyed. Her car had been blown, smashed into a tree, and well, there's nothing really more to say about that. We brought her back to my hometown to bury her in the same cemetery as my grandmother. She was going to be buried next to her parents, and not too far away from where my paternal grandmother was buried. I hadn't been back to this cemetery since the first time I'd ever been, and you know when that was. Again, the words of the priest washed over me, talking about resting in peace, but the words weren't landing. I was still in shock. I couldn't believe my mum was gone. As the guy was talking, something made me turn to my right. As I looked, I saw something that stunned me. There was a little girl walking from the path. I thought she must be someone's daughter, but then the details came into sharper focus. The familiar shape of her nose, the exact shade of her eyes, even the faint gap between her front teeth. And recognition hit me so suddenly it felt like a brick being slapped into my face. I was staring at my 10-year-old self, standing only a few feet away from my mother's grave. She didn't glow or float or do anything theatrically ghostly. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and the comprehension and fear dawned on her face, and after a few agonizing seconds of staring at one another, she turned around and bolted. For a moment, I was contemplating to run after her, and that's when she disappeared. I couldn't even speak. In those few seconds, so much had happened, but no one else around me had seemed to notice anything. No one reacted, and the priest's drone carried on. In that moment, the long-buried memory from my grandmother's funeral surged back with blinding clarity. The realization settled over me with a kind of dizzy inevitability. I had not seen some random doppelganger of my mother that day. I had not just witnessed some anonymous child at my mother's funeral. We had been looking at each other across the same looped moment in time. 10-year-old me grieving her grandmother and wandering towards an unfamiliar funeral had seen 35-year-old me standing at my mother's grave and interpreted her as an older version of my mum, or 35-year-old me burying her mother had just watched her 10-year-old self approach and flee in terror. I have no way to describe anything that happened. I tried to put it to the back of my mind after that, to process my mother's death and go through all the legal stuff that happened after. But once it was all over, that was the thing that struck me the most. I didn't really know where to share this or who to talk to about it, so if anyone has any explanation, I would be profoundly grateful, because I need to know what the hell happened, and why, if there is any explanation. When I was a kid, everyone told me I had a vivid imagination, which is a nice way of saying I talked to myself a lot, and insisted there was a boy in the room that no one else could see. His name was Jesse. I don't remember him in the way you remember real people now, a clear face, a voice, a specific detail about him. He was more of an outline, if you get what I mean. I spoke to him constantly, but he was never quite in focus, if you get my drift. My parents used to ask about him. What did Jesse do today? Where's Jesse now? I just thought they were playing along with my game. Fast forward a few decades and I'm back in Ireland visiting relatives, and my family, who have absolutely no shortage of creepy stories, are talking about their ghost stories over tea. At some point my mum goes, "Oh, tell them about Jesse," and drops his name into conversation like it means nothing. I feel my stomach do this slow, unsteady flip, because I haven't heard that name spoken in years. In my head, Jesse had always been filed under imaginary friend, firmly in the same drawer as Santa and the Tooth Fairy and stuff like that. Apparently, though, everyone else had a very different category for his very existence. Mum starts off by saying she never understood where I got the name Jesse from, because we didn't know anyone called that. No cousins or neighbours, TV or movie characters. It just happened one day with my 2-year-old self. That alone, though, didn't strike me as anything more than strange coincidence. Maybe we heard it at the park or something and I just liked the name. Then she tells me about the morning my dad was getting ready to leave for work. At the time, he was working as an electrician down in a mine, which is not exactly the kind of job you explain in detail to a toddler. According to her, he was at the door, boots on and ready to leave, when I toddled over and tugged his trouser leg, looked him dead in the eye and said, "Bring back some coal for Jessie's gran." I was 2, barely tall enough to reach the doorknob, and now giving a very specific request about Jessie's ghost grandmother. Now at that age I should have not had a working concept of a mine or coal, or a gran who lives somewhere who needs fuel, and definitely shouldn't have connected the idea of my dad going underground fiddling with wires, which meant that coal would be involved. Do you get what I mean? I definitely didn't have the vocabulary for that. Hell, there are probably adults who couldn't even put that together. Mum says my dad just froze, staring at me like I'd started speaking fluent Russian. "Did you tell her to do that?" he asked, but my mum shook her head. I'm listening to this years later, and part of my brain is still trying to be rational in this room, offering explanations like, "Oh, maybe I heard it on TV," or maybe they just mentioned coal without me remembering. But the rest of me is remembering how seriously I took Jessie back then, and starting to feel a bit sick. And now we get to the graveyard part. So Mum says we used to go on day trips to this particular place when I was very young. I would be running around all sugared up, and my parents would try to prevent me from launching myself into a river, which apparently I really wanted to do. On one of these trips, though, I took off with absolutely no warning. Of course, they run after me because that's what you do when your small child suddenly bolts, and they watch as I veer off the path and slip through an old iron gate. They'd never even come this way and didn't even know it was there, into a little-known graveyard. I am wandering around the headstones, and finally, I stop in the middle of a random grave. I don't say anything much. I just stand there, staring at this headstone. When my parents catch me up, ready to give me a stern telling off, they look what I'm looking at, and carved right there on the stone is the word Jessie. And it's not a new headstone either. It's an old, worn one, weathered, with dates placing the death long before I was even a thought, before my parents were even a thought for that matter. It's definitely a child's grave, given the size. My mum says she felt her heart drop into her bum, and my dad went really quiet. I, of course, have zero memory of this. I don't remember the graveyard or the grave, or the name carved there. I don't remember asking for coal for his gran. To me, this is all new data, arriving years after the fact, landing on top of the vague childhood awareness of an imaginary friend. But the way Mum tells it, and the way my relatives just sit there nodding, looking fascinated, tells me this is not one of those stories that got inflated over time. This is just how it happened. So now I'm sitting there doing mental gymnastics, trying to reconcile that I had an imaginary friend called Jessie, which I apparently led my parents straight to the grave of. The skeptical part of me is frantically throwing out plausible explanations. Maybe I'd seen the grave on an earlier trip and subconsciously remembered the name, even though I couldn't spell or knew what letters were. I don't know. Hearing the story as an adult gave me chills. What do you think? We signed up to clean this cemetery, mostly because it got us out of the house and away from homework, not because either of us were especially noble. It was senior year, and a big storm had rolled through our little town, and the church put out a call for volunteers. My best friend at the time dragged me along with the promise of coffee after, so there we were with work gloves and a trash bag, doing our good deed among the dead. It was a bright, ordinary afternoon, and we were walking slowly between the graves, talking about absolutely everything except the work in front of us. We were just picking up branches, setting toppled flowers back on headstones, and cursing quietly every time our shoes got mud on them. That's when we start joking about who would be the first one to die before graduation, and who would we haunt if that happened. The cemetery, during the day, as you probably know, isn't very spooky. So we were mid-conversation about something trivial, which teacher we hated most, I think, when both of us stopped. We froze at the exact same instant. Without saying a word, we both turned our heads over our shoulders and looked at the same empty patch of air behind us. "What did you hear?" I asked. "I'll tell you if you tell me first," she shot back, which meant we were on the same wavelength and both a bit freaked out. So I took a breath and said, "I thought I heard someone say, 'shh,' right behind us." Her face went blank for half a heartbeat and then she nodded. "Yeah, me too, like right in my ear." There's wind noise, and then there's someone telling you to shut up. And this had been very clearly the second kind. It wasn't the whispery whoosh of branches in the wind. It was unmistakably human, like when a librarian catches you being loud in a library. That was the sound right behind our heads, as if a woman was standing between us and had had enough of it. We kept staring at that empty spot, squinting hard, expecting someone to solidify, but nothing did. The nearest other volunteer was down a path at least 50 feet away and busy wrestling a fallen wreath back into place. For them to make a sound that crisp at our backs, they would have had to shout. It had been a hiss you use because you're standing close and you don't want to draw anyone else's attention. I felt that slow, cold ripple creep up my spine. "Okay, that's creepy," I said, brilliant observation skills on full display. "Hang on," my friend said, already moving towards the spot we'd been staring at. "If someone's telling us to be quiet, I want to know who." We weren't standing on top of a grave or anything. We'd been in one of those lanes between rows, just talking and tossing small branches into a trash bag. She stepped off the path onto the grass, walked the few paces to the headstone directly in front of where we'd both turned, and brushed some wet leaves away so she could read the name. I stood back, watching her. It was a woman's name, someone neither of us recognized, followed by dates that put her somewhere in her 20s when she died. The inscription mentioned beloved mother and wife. That word snagged on something inside me. My friend didn't say anything else. She just shifted one step and looked down to the stone directly next to her, which was a smaller one. There was simply a name and two dates that were agonizingly close together, separated by a dash. We stood there in the slanting afternoon light, looking at the pair, mother and baby together side by side in the earth. And my friend said, "Do you think we were keeping a dead baby awake?" It sounds insane, I know. "Yeah," my friend said. "I think we were being too loud." We didn't bolt, or scream, or throw our bags and run for the car. We just started speaking more quieter, finished our section of the cemetery, and continued on. I don't know if it was the wind or coincidence, whatever, you take your pick. But I think at that moment, the ghost of that mum came to ask us to be a bit more respectful of the space where she and her young child were laid for their final rest. And I'm okay with that. We lived in a slice of New England absolutely riddled with historical cemeteries. My dad has this fascination with them, always dragged us out to wander the overgrown paths, look at faded inscriptions, etc. Some of those plots dated back to the 1600s, time capsules of plague victims, witch hunt casualties, etc. One grey afternoon, he's motoring down some godforsaken back road when this tiny old church pops into view, huddled against a small adjacent graveyard. He's got time to kill, his curiosity piqued, so he swings the car into the rutted dirt car park, crunching gravel under tires, and reckons he'll have a nose about. I'm 4 years old, strapped in the back seat with a woolly hat pulled low, oblivious to much beyond the promise of biscuits later, and Dad hauls me out into the air, sharp with the first flakes of light snow. He starts exploring the graveyard first, me bouncing along atop of him as he weaves between tilting headstones. He pauses a few times, looks at the slabs. They date back to the early 1700s. I'm babbling nonsense up there, pointing at crows while he murmurs facts to himself. Satisfied with the graves for now, he ambles over to the church itself. It's a squat old relic. He circles a couple of sides, with snow starting to swirl around us lazily. When out of nowhere I pipe up clear as day, "Daddy, where did the lady go?" Dad wheezes mid-stride, twists his head up, and squints at me through the flurries. "What lady, mate?" I jab a tiny, mittened finger, dead ahead, plain as you like. "The lady over there, in the white dress." He follows my point to the front corner of the church, the exact spot we just rounded from the back, and feels the first proper prickle of fear crawl up his neck. Now Dad's a no-nonsense to the bone ex-Marine who stared down worse than a snow ghost in actual war zones. But the thing is, no one else has been here. There have been no cars. As I said, it's a pretty abandoned road. No voices, no anything. Still he plays it steady, trudges right over to the spot I'd flagged, and, craning down to look, he scans the snow-dusted ground, and there are no footprints bar his own heavy boot prints looping around the church. No delicate lady tracks trailing off into the bushes, no sign any human has parked up, stepped out, or scarpered in a white dress, with fresh powdery snow mocking him pristinely. That's when it hits him like a punch to the gut, and he throws me into the car seat and we peel out of there. Funny thing is, I've always carried this vivid mental snapshot of this dark-haired woman drifting around that corner in a flowing white wedding gown, lace trimmed with ethereal beauty. Could this be my brain filling in the blanks to make up this toddler? Dad swears the story's true, of course I don't remember it. I've poked back there as an adult a few times, but never seen anything. My dad, at any rate, swears by this story, and the testimony of a 4-year-old. I had a few weird things happen in that cemetery over the years, but 2 of them still sit in the back of my mind. My oldest brother and his friends were spooky goth kids who always enjoyed hanging out in cemeteries, and occasionally would do something vaguely helpful for the dead, like pick up knocked over flowers or set broken stones back to where they belonged. That night it was him, my mum, me, and 2 or 3 of his friends. I was carrying this old flip phone that didn't have any charge. I mostly used it as a digital watch because I was too lazy to actually buy one, and by the time we got to the cemetery, it was very much a lifeless brick in my pocket. We were wandering through one of the older sections, the part with upright headstones instead of the flat lawn markers. We were talking, picking up branches from the last windstorm, and joking about. I stepped over a grave, and the moment my foot touched the ground on the other side, something in my pocket buzzed, and the electronic chirp cut through the noise. I fished out my flip phone and opened it. The screen was lit and it was ringing. No caller ID, no number, just incoming call. I hadn't seen this in months because this thing didn't have service and the battery had completely died earlier in the day. "Mum?" I said, walking towards her, phone in hand. "Look at this." By the time I took a few steps and reached her side, the ringing cut off, and the screen went dark again. I pressed buttons, flipped it open and closed it like it would magically help. But it returned to being just a dead phone. We all kind of shrugged it off and said, "Weird, must be a glitch. Maybe it's picking up static." But I remember everyone glancing around a little more often as we kept walking. A little further on, we came across a headstone that had been knocked flat, either by the storm or someone mean, and my brother decided we were going to fix it. We all gathered around, put our hands on the cold stone, and tried to lift it back upright. The thing didn't budge though. Between the 5 or 6 of us, straining and grunting and getting mud all over our shoes, we managed to shift it about an inch and then gave up. We turned back the way we'd come, following the same path through the upright stones, and somewhere around that same patch of ground where my phone had come back from the dead, it happened again. The same buzz. Everyone was close enough to see it. I flipped open my phone. The screen was lit. The ringtone was gone, but there was no number, nothing except incoming call. "You see this, right?" I asked everyone. Everyone nodded. The phone rang twice more and cut off mid-chirp and went black, so abruptly it felt like someone on the other end must have hung up. We stood there for a moment. The phone went back to being dead for the rest of the night. Logically, you can write it off as bad hardware, electromagnetic interference, but emotionally, it felt like stepping on someone's eternal nap and getting a warning call about it. That should have been the end of the night's weirdness, but as we headed back towards the car, something pulled at me. Something sharp and specific and urgent. To go to the newer side of the cemetery, instead of straight to the parking lot. I didn't say anything to the group, I just veered off, following this inexplicable tug. The newer section only had flat markers, all neatly lined up in perfect rows under the grass. The feeling was pulling me straight to one stone, and when I got close enough to read it in the faint moonlight, my stomach dropped. It belonged to a little boy, maybe 5 years old. One of those small oval photos was embedded in the stone, showing a serious-faced kid with a gap-toothed smile. Earlier that day, I'd bought a Beanie Baby on impulse at some cheap store. Standing there staring at that photo, the urge hit for me to leave it for him. So I knelt down, tucked the toy against the edge of the stone where it wouldn't blow away, whispered a small prayer and apology, and left. From then on, for years until I moved away in 2009, I'd be at thrift stores or garage sales, and whenever I'd spot some small toy or trinket, plastic dinosaur or whatever, maybe a Hot Wheels, I'd think he'd like this, buy it, drive to Riverside and leave it on that flat stone, among a growing pile of little kid gifts for a stranger. I visited whenever I was in town, straightened the toys when they got knocked over by the wind or rain, and added more every once in a while. I never knew his name. I never felt scared about being haunted or anything. I just wanted to do something for a kid who didn't have anything anymore. The cemetery we are talking about is Greenwood Cemetery in southwest Decatur, Illinois. It's one of the most haunted places in the Midwest. A TLDR of the history is that it used to be a burial ground, became a Civil War mass grave, was associated with some cult practice, and a massive flood washed up a lot of graves a long time ago. My sister Cecilia has always been drawn to the paranormal and Wicca. This was a bit of a problem for her, as she was raised by our great-grandparents, who, while very kind-hearted, were also very religious. Because of this, Cecilia felt trapped in the rural countryside and wanted to make her own way. So, she got a house in Decatur, which at the time was becoming a giant ghetto of drugs and crime, like it mostly is today, which was already pretty messed up. There was this room in the basement that was literally dirt and it was super creepy. The old man who used to live there had died, and Cecilia's mum had been in the house before, and she said everything was black like it was scorched. So there was already darkness in that house. Cecilia was depressed from life and financial trouble, and as a sort of refuge, took to paranormal hunts with her friends, who I won't bother naming. The place they frequented was Greenwood Cemetery. This place was like a sanctuary for her. In a strange sort of way, it was like an addiction. She would go there at midnight with her dog Brutus, who is still with us and is a very good pup. Nothing too serious other than some strange sounds came then. But it was when she went with her friends that things got crazy. The first time they went, they took a bunch of pictures. I don't think they had a video camera, and stuff really went down. The boisterous friend, who was very aggressive, went to a light pole and said, "If anyone is with us, knock back," as he knocked on the pole. They kept on the path, and a few moments later 2 very loud knocks were heard. They looked back but didn't see anything. They continued further before they all stopped and felt like time was frozen, and that something forcibly turned their heads towards a gravel road on the other side of a chain-link fence. Right as this happened, they all saw 2 shadowy figures running like dogs down the road. They made no sound, no breathing, and were like a misty smoke. All of them felt like they couldn't move until the dogs had passed. At this point, they all noped out of there, literally sprinting a full mile back to the car. Cecilia did some research and found that some other people had reported seeing the dogs before, but that they were apparently a rare sighting. The pictures they took were filled to the brim with orbs of all different colors and sizes, but they never made copies, and those phones have long since died. So sadly, I can't share the pictures. After a while, they built up the courage to go back and went to the worst part of the cemetery, that they call Hell's Hollow. They were acting honestly like dicks, and talking about how it all wasn't real. They didn't actually believe this, but they were trying to get a reaction and nothing happened. This strategy worked really well, because out of nowhere they heard a blood-curdling scream from the sky, like a woman being torn in half. They felt watched, and stumbled across a pile of guts with no sign of a body. This is probably just animal snacks, but it could be related. They once again got the hell out of there back to the car, where they sat for a while and talked. One of Cecilia's friends had a cat laser on her and was screwing around with it, shining it at the windows. As she did this, the tree lit up with these lights. Cecilia said that they lit up in a pattern, 2 white and then a deep red. They certainly weren't flashlights or man-made. At this point, they are freaking out, and then the chain-link fence starts shaking violently. They sped away, but felt like they were being followed. When they got home, things were fine. But now, there was something in the closet. They pretty much all experienced whatever entity this was at some point. Cecilia was terrified of the closet and often heard clawing or growling noises coming from within it after Greenwood. Brutus, the dog, was always on edge in the house, but his discomfort was growing worse. Additionally, some doors in the basement would open randomly, especially the ones near the dirt room, and stomping sounds from random rooms happened all the time, especially if someone was alone. People would hear their names being called when they showered, especially Cecilia. I think whatever it was attached to Cecilia the most, her dark emotional state really fueled the entity. At one point, she was left alone with Brutus at night during a power outage. Nothing happened, but Cecilia could sense that it was in the house with her. During one of the last days at that place, she was doing dishes when Brutus came over to her suddenly and kept booping her in distress. She first dismissed it, but turned to see a shapeless, shadowy mass rolling over the furniture and floating down the hall. She took Brutus and sat on the porch for hours until the others came home. They had previously rented this house to this guy, who left suddenly about a week later after presumably experiencing something else. Cecilia also has premonition-type dreams a lot, as well as warnings. A while ago, she was beginning to experiment with Wicca, after falling into a deep depression after the death of our great-grandparents and a whole bunch of personal family stuff. She had a dream that her grandmother was pissed off for bringing the darkness here, all the while the shadowy figures were clawing against the windows. She has turned her life around and regained her faith in Christ, which seems to have warded off the darkness that might have been attached to her. But yeah, good luck out there and God bless, I suppose. I've got a story to share. One day, me and my mate were walking past my local cemetery. He was from a different town, so he wasn't familiar with this specific cemetery, but I had visited it frequently as a kid while riding my bike. We were both pretty stoned, and it was nighttime, so obviously there was a little exciting paranoia running through us, but that doesn't explain what happened in any sense. So, we were walking past this cemetery, and me being the playful idiot most young men are, I decided to attempt to creep my mate out. I can't remember exactly what I did, but I attempted to get my mate to imagine a figure in the dark, and while I'm in the middle of building this image in his head, a small orange candle comes to light on in the distance. He spots it and points it out to me. And then another one. And then another one on the side of the cemetery comes on. Soon enough, there were over 30 lights across the whole thing. The numbers kept growing too. We were obviously scared out of our minds and decided to sprint to my house around the corner. Now, we have gone over it many times as we have gotten older, and still can't come to any logical explanation as to what it actually was. We weren't high enough whatsoever to be hallucinating. In fact, we have never hallucinated from weed before. We theorized that if it was gypsies, as there was a small gypsy community in the town, maybe trying to play a prank, but it was very late, the cemetery gates were closed, and the sheer number of lights and no sound coming from within seemed way too coordinated for those people, and it also seemed like too much effort for such little reward. The next day, I went there on my bike and checked the graves for those small solar-powered garden lights that are sometimes found on graves, but of course, there was nothing to be seen. To this day, I question what happened there. I don't really get creeped out by it though. It's almost quite a warm memory for me, a strange but good memory with my buddy. That cemetery, by the way, is Esching Cemetery, in the town of Godalming, Surrey. If there are any curious detectives who would like to get to the bottom of this spooky mystery, I would love an answer. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you have enjoyed tonight's collection of cemetery stories. Certainly a spooky collection, wouldn't you say? And if you did, it would be fantastic if you subscribed if you aren't already, because apparently about 35% of you aren't, so, that'd be nice. Let's keep in touch, I know you like the spooks. I'd like to give one final thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. Your support really does go an awful long way, so thank you all for being here and contributing. And if you'd like your name here and a bunch of cool extra perks, feel free to follow the link to find out more. I, in fact, do have a cool collection of Glitch in the Matrix stories scheduled in for tomorrow. So if that's your jam, feel free to follow the link to hear it tomorrow, I guess. But that's it from me. I'll see you all on Saturday. Stay awesome, and good night.